Hi, I'm Caitlin, a podcast producer here at C-SPAN. This week on C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast, USA Today's Susan Page speaks about the life and career of Barbara Walters. Ann Compton, former ABC News White House correspondent, interviews her.
Since March 19, 1979, C-SPAN, a public service funded by the cable television industry, began giving you direct access to government in an innovative way by putting you, the viewer, into the rooms where politics is debated and policies are determined. C-SPAN began as a bold initiative. Now, 45 years later, we are essential for those wanting to see democracy at work, without editing or commentary. With continued cable support, we've done this without a dime of government funding, maintaining our independence. As we mark 45 years, the business of media is rapidly changing, and now your support is crucial for our mission's future. Support our legacy of unfiltered access by donating today at cspan.org/donate. Thank you.
Susan, Barbara Walters was known as a history maker, a groundbreaker, but why a rule breaker?
You know, we struggled a little with the title, and I would ask people, what should I title this biography of Barbara Walters? And people suggested things like $1 Million Baby or Ba Ba Wah Wah. I mean, these were actually slings and arrows that she endured, and it was interesting that that's what came to mind with some people when I talked about a biography of Barbara Walters. But it was my editor at Simon & Schuster, Priscilla Payton, who said, she really strikes me as a rule breaker. And rule breaker seemed to be exactly right, because Barbara Walters broke every rule around. And, you know, she didn't just break rules, she ignored them. She pretended she couldn't see them. So the idea that a woman couldn't do serious interviews, she just ignored it and went ahead and scheduled serious interviews. The idea that a woman couldn't be paid as much as a man, well, she certainly blew that idea up. The idea later in life that a woman couldn't age on TV. You know, she was 67 when she embarked on her last big adventure, The View, the ABC talk show. So rule breaker seemed to me to be exactly right.
And a rule maker as well. What intrigued me on the cover of the book is a picture of Barbara Walters when she had just joined ABC News, where I had already been for a year or two. What is happening at that moment that picture is taken?
This picture is from 1976. That was the year she reached the pinnacle that she had sought for so long, to be named co-anchor of an evening network newscast, the ABC Evening News. And it had been a terrible experience. She was going into what we today would call a hostile workplace. Her co-anchor, Harry Reasoner, initially threatened to quit if they brought her on board. He treated her with such contempt on the air that they stopped doing two shots. Now, I know you know what a two shot is, but a two shot is where they would show both anchors, but they were afraid to show Harry Reasoner listening to Barbara Walters on the air because he was so often scowling.
I was going to say, he could scowl and make a kind of a physical response to her without having to utter a word.
His contempt was perfectly clear. ABC started to get letters from viewers, mostly women viewers, saying, what in the world is going on? This isn't fair. And they finally developed a form letter in response that said, please give it some time. We know this is going to work out all right. That's how bad it was. But for Barbara Walters, she felt she was failing. She felt she was drowning. Not only was she drowning, she said, but there were people who wanted to hold her head under the water. And this was a point where she was not entirely sure if she would recover, if her career would recover, or if her ambitions had gotten so big that they would undermine the achievements she already had scored.
Well, let me take you a year ahead, December of 1977. And President Jimmy Carter was visiting Iran. New Year's Eve with the Shah. Barbara and I were both for ABC News on the trip, and the big press charter lands in Tehran just ahead of Air Force One. And there is a car waiting for me to whisk me over to a local museum where Mrs. Carter, without the president, was going to go visit right from the airport. And I get into this sedan sitting behind this Iranian driver, and there's an interpreter in the front seat, an Egyptian. And I'm told that the reason there's an interpreter is because an Iranian man would never take driving directions from a woman. So the Egyptian turns to me and says, the driver would like to know if you know Miss Barbara Walters. Tehran, 1977. I said, indeed, we work for the same company. And the Egyptian said, he wants to know, is it true she is paid $1 million a month? And I said, well, actually, I think it's $1 million a year. And the driver's face fell. Barbara Walters was already a global icon. And didn't that kind of propel her career from that point on?
Isn't that a wonderful story? Because how many journalists have had similar experiences to that? And you know, one of them who did was Walter Cronkite. So Walter Cronkite was, of course, the leading anchor of the day and a figure of unquestioned authority and someone who viewed Barbara Walters with a little bit of skepticism about whether she was a real journalist. And they were both trying to cover the groundbreaking things that were happening in the Middle East, the groundbreaking trip of Anwar Sadat of Egypt to Israel. And it was Barbara Walters and her ability to cultivate relations with world leaders that a few months earlier in 1977 enabled her to get the first sit-down interview with both the Egyptian president and the Israeli prime minister. And this was the interview that not only solidified her comeback from her sad experience as a co-anchor of the Evening News, it also beat Walter Cronkite, which both of them knew.
Yeah, and that interview, split screen, it was not only a moment for journalism, it changed American foreign policy and Middle East policy at a really, really difficult time. So how did Barbara Walters make that leap, not only from NBC's Today Show, which very high profile, and then into the anchor chair, and then into this kind of interviewing mega operation? Did she do it all by herself? Did she have allies? I mean, how did she survive that?
She had one big ally, and that was Roone Arledge, the legendary head of ABC News and of ABC Sports before that. And Roone Arledge took over the news division at a time that both Harry and Barbara were on the air together. Mm-hmm. And it was clear this was not a sustainable pairing of two anchors. And Roone Arledge made it clear that he was on Barbara's side. That even though Barbara's, being an anchor was really not Barbara's strength. Mm-hmm. But despite that, he saw there were many Harry Reasners. There was only one Barbara Walters. So Harry Reasner saw the writing on the wall, went back to CBS, and Barbara Walters did not lose her anchor title, but Roone Arledge redefined how the evening news was going to work with three guys working in different capitals, and Barbara's still technically an anchor, but gradually she went back to what she did best, which was the big interview. She didn't create the big TV interview. I think you'd say Edward R. Murrow did that. But she expanded it and defined it and reshaped it and came to dominate that genre.
Yeah, absolutely true. The Today Show experience, where she was clearly always told to be second fiddle or third fiddle, did that help her in the later reaching out to a broader, not just politicians and national leaders, but really broadened her access to other figures?
So here's a life lesson from Barbara Walters, which is life gives you lemons, make lemonade. Here's how she did that. She had been on the Today Show when the host was Hugh Downs, mm-hmm. who was very supportive of her, one of the very few men on the air who supported Barbara Walters and her ambitions.
And later in life,
and later on
came to ABC News and supported her again.
Exactly. So Hugh Downs is the exception to the rule of men who were not welcoming Barbara Walters. But he left and was replaced by Frank McGee, who was a serious newsman who had no great regard for women journalists. And he set a rule that when they were doing an interview together on the NBC set, on the Today Show set, Barbara Walters could not speak until he had asked the first three questions. Now, can you imagine? So she would sit there for the first three questions, waiting her time until it was her turn and she was allowed to speak. It sounds like something that would happen in an Iranian taxi cab, right? And willing to take directions from a woman. So what Barbara Walters did was she started to arrange her own interviews outside the studio. Not remote from Washington, not on the NBC set, mm-hmm. but in other places, in people's homes and offices, with newsmakers who didn't do very many interviews. And this became, of course, her defining achievement, this ability to do interviews with people in other places, not sitting in an interview suite like this one. And that was the result of necessity, because if she set up an interview and was interviewing someone in their home, she could ask the first question and the second question and the third question and all the others.
Yeah. I want to ask, or to take a minute to look at the kind of environment that the nation was experiencing during this, not only the time that she came to ABC News and then the time that she left the anchor and developed this other, this new persona role. I had joined ABC News in 1974, tail end of 74. And all through that period, 76, all the way up to the 1980 elections, this was a time when America was being torn apart by opposition to the Vietnam War, which was dragging on. This was a time in which Watergate had still left its sting, and the kind of chaos. And it was a very, very news-heavy, very difficult time. And you add to that the fact that women were not as evident and were not as part of it. I think the world that she went into, especially for women, was much, much different than it is today.
You know, one reason I made the subtitle of the book, The Life and Times of Barbara Walters, is because I wanted to talk about the times. The times were so different from today's times. You know, it's not like it's ancient history. It's a couple decades ago. And yet, as you said, a time of such tumultuous change for Black people in this country, for women in this country. I mean, in so many ways, our nation was undergoing upheavals, and she was swimming in those waters. You know, she was not. Barbara Walters lived a feminist life, but she didn't espouse a feminist agenda. She was very focused on cutting a path for herself, and in doing that, she cut a path for other women, yourself, myself, to follow. She made things easier for us by doing what she did. But she was pretty focused on her own career. And it's so interesting that you actually were at ABC just before she was. Do you remember the first time you met her?
Oh, I do. And it's a funny little story. The first time I met her, Gerald Ford was the brand new president who had been swept in, not elected, but after Watergate when President Nixon resigned. And that's when I arrived. Nixon left on the South Lawn, I came in the North Lawn, and we were in China with Gerald Ford. And there was a day when he sat in the hotel waiting for the phone call to go see Mao Zedong. But I went with Betty Ford to all these, she danced at the May 7th schools. We went to the Great Wall of China. And Barbara also came along on these trips. And we were in a museum, and those of us who cover the White House know kind of how to tail the principal and how to get in close. And Barbara kind of wandered around and looked at things. And as we came out of the museum, she went to the car with her camera crew. But we stood at the doorway of the museum, and we got a great interview with her. And I thought, well, yeah, she's a Today Show. She was Today Show host at that point, and it shows that doing, news reporting. Cut forward to she has arrived at the ABC News Bureau to meet everybody. And I happened to be up on the executive top floor in the ladies' room. And she came in, used the ladies' room, came out, and she came out and she said, they don't have any towels. Can't they afford to have any towels here? And I thought, well, I'm not going to say that $1 million salary has cut into our towel allotment. But yeah, she had struggles every step of the way during those, especially those early months and years.
And I realize you're interviewing me, but just one more question about that. So you're one of the White House reporters, and here comes this Bigfoot, Barbara Walters. What did the White House press corps think of her?
She didn't come to the White House and hang with us in the press briefing room. She was a presence, especially during that time where she got the Sadat Begin interview. All that was done, obviously, away from the White House. But when we traveled with her, it was that New Year's Eve in Tehran. At midnight, they brought the travel pool, me and a couple of other reporters, up to the elegant ballroom of the Niavaran Palace. They opened the doors, and there was President Carter and Mrs. Carter, Shah of Iran, King Hussein of Jordan, and they just all said, Happy New Year, toasted champagne and everything. And I said, Mr. President, you're going to go to Egypt tomorrow to see President Sadat. Why is that? He went, what? Barbara wasn't there because she and John Chancellor of NBC and some of the other bigwigs had been invited to the party, and they were off dancing somewhere. And indeed, a few minutes later, we went back downstairs. The president's Secret Service agent, Dick Kaiser, came and got me, said, the president needs to see you. I came back upstairs, and the president said, well, Cy Vance just told me, the Secretary of State just told me, yes, we're going to Egypt and meeting President Sadat at Aswan. So sometimes, being in the right place at the right time, but she was always kind of an aura apart from the working stiffs at the White House.
Yeah. Well, that's an example of good sourcing when you know where the president's going to go the next day and he doesn't.
Yeah. Let's move to what the part of the Barbara years at ABC News that I knew the best. Central casting could not have designed two more perfect protagonists than Barbara Walters and Diane Sawyer. I mean, that's the stuff. They could make movies. Mike Nichols could make a movie out of that.
Mike Nichols, who was Diane Sawyer's husband. Yes, Rune Arledge, who had been Barbara's protector, and who was Barbara's most important professional relationship, had been courting Diane Sawyer to come over from CBS, courting her for close to a year. And she finally agreed to come over, and only then did Barbara hear about it. And she saw this as a betrayal, that hiring Diane would be directly in competition for the big interviews that were her signature. And in other ways, Diane Sawyer pushed every button for Barbara Walters. Barbara Walters had a speech anomaly, but Diane Sawyer spoke very gracefully. Barbara Walters didn't think she was beautiful. Well, Diane Sawyer is one of the most beautiful women in American television news. Barbara Walters had to scrap and struggle every step of the way, and Diane Sawyer had a much easier path to getting to this job of anchoring her own interview show on ABC. And I think that Diane, who I interviewed for the book, was taken aback by the ferocity of the rivalry that Barbara greeted her with.
What astonishes me, and again, I was White House in Washington, I was not in New York, when the two of them competed to try to get the same newsmaker interviews, but I do remember, didn't see it as it happened, Bill Clinton was President of the United States, and as people may know, the White House hands out network interviews, not to the White House reporters, but to the big anchor stars. And it was kind of ABC's turn. What happened?
So Rune Arledge, the head of the news division, decreed that it was Diane's turn. And Diane would get, if the network got a Bill Clinton interview, which wasn't guaranteed, but they thought was entirely possible, that it was supposed to go to Diane. And talk about ignoring a rule. Barbara Walters went around the system, lobbied Mike McCurry, the press secretary, and others, explained not only why she should get the interview, but why Diane Sawyer should not. And the ABC Washington bureau chief, Robin Sproul, who was in the middle of this and had been very much involved in, listen everybody, it is Diane's turn. Diane is going to get this interview if we get one. She got a call from the White House, from the press secretary, who said, you're getting the interview and we've decided it's going to Barbara. So Robin understood that this was going to cause some internal consternation. So she calls Rune Arledge and says, the good news is we've got the interview with Clinton. The bad news is the White House is giving it to Barbara. And he exploded in anger because it was just the latest. It was the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of Barbara's rivalry with Diane, which had made Diane very unhappy, which Diane was complaining about. And Rune Arledge said to the Washington bureau chief of ABC, turn it down. Tell them we won't take it. Which is, as you know, Unheard of.
Totally unheard of.
You don't turn down an interview with the president because they won't give it to the
chosen
correspondent you
reporter.
want. That's right. Oh. That's not the way it works. And the Washington Bureau Chief tried to said, this will become a story. This will not be kept quiet.
This is the refusal to do.
If we turn this interview now, the world will know it, and it will be embarrassing. And Rune Arledge said, turn it down, and hung up. Now, Robin Sproul, who is a friend of mine, Robin tried to think about how to explain to the White House that ABC was turning down this prime presidential interview. She was still trying to figure that out when Rune Arledge's assistant called her back and said, have you done that thing that Rune asked you to do? And Robin said no. And the assistant said, well, then don't. Everything will be okay. And they took the interview.
Whoa. The timing, of course, on this interview was interesting. It was 1996,
yeah.
So it was re-election year.
Yeah.
And we did not know the name Monica Lewinsky, but that was already. Now, when that was not the only time there was a trying to steal interviews. Was it Diane's first? Oh, real quickly, Barbara Walters' argument to Mike McCurry, the press secretary, was everybody knows where the president stands on issues, but his character, can we trust him? And that came, I mean, that resonated, and of course, eventually became an issue.
Well, she did have an ability to conceptualize what she ought to try to get out of an interview. Yeah. And that would include an interview with presidents. And she was, and you know, it was also a characteristic of hers that she interviewed people about policy. She interviewed foreign policy leaders about foreign policy, but she was always interested in the human side of the story and the personality behind the newsmaker. And in this case, she had conceptualized an approach to this interview that was very appealing to the White House, because in fact, some Americans didn't think Bill Clinton had high character, and this would have been a chance for him to make that case. You know, one thing that's ironic, this story, which had enormous internal repercussions. I went through the archives, the Rune Arledge archives, and there is
where are those?
They're in Columbia.
Yeah.
And in the archives there is this very defensive long memo from Barbara Walters trying to explain how this happened, because she understood that she was really on thin ice as a result of this, that this had cost her something. And she had this long explanation about how it came about and how she certainly couldn't have been blamed. And of course, it was only natural that it was time for her to get the interview. And by the way, other networks were interested in hiring her. And so she closed this memo with this implicit threat that if you punish me for this, I'll walk away. And so there were no professional repercussions, but I can tell you that that was an incident that all those involved remembered very clearly.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was not a 3-page letter of apology.
There was no apology in this letter.
Did Diane ever try to steal a Barbara guest?
Well, now Diane Sawyer is also a very competitive person. How could she have achieved all that she's achieved in journalism without being that way? And there are those who say she gave as good as she got in the competition for interviews. But the really notorious stories like that one, they tend to be about Barbara.
Yeah, not surprised. I want to take a little bit more personal look at Barbara Walters, because I think one of the gifts of this book is not only unearthing new facts about the very public Barbara, but you give a much more complete picture of her as a woman. Can we start by looking at the forces that shaped her?
Yeah.
Her family, her marriages, her daughter.
So I think so much about Barbara Walters was shaped by her father, Lew Walters, who was one of the leading impresarios of his generation, creator of the famous Latin Quarter, which started in Boston and then opened in Miami and then finally nightclub and finally in New York. It booked the biggest acts there were in the country and was one of the top tourist destinations in New York when Lew Walters was in charge of it. And Lew Walters was a guy who had a wonderful touch a wonderful understanding of what audiences wanted. That was an asset that she inherited from him. But he was also a gambler, and he would make $1 million and gamble it away playing gin rummy.
Literally gambling it away?
Literally gamble it away. He would make $1 million with the Latin Quarter and then decide he wanted to open a new nightclub, and it would flop and he would be bankrupt. And it finally, I think a pivot point in Barbara Walters' life came when she was 28 years old. She was pretty, she had gotten out of college, out of Sarah Lawrence, but she wasn't exactly on a career path. She had gotten married to a guy, but then she had just gotten divorced. She had gone to Alabama for a quickie divorce of dubious legality, but they were now divorced. She had come back to New York City and was staying with a school friend at her apartment when her father attempted suicide. He came home from his new nightclub, which was clearly about to fold, after just a few weeks. He took all the sleeping pills in the jar and was found by his wife the next morning. And his wife did not call an ambulance. His wife called Barbara. Barbara came over to the hotel. It was Barbara who called the ambulance. Barbara rode in the ambulance to the hospital, then stayed with her father. And later she said the thing that she realized in a flash was that the financial and emotional support for her family now fell on her. Her father was suicidal. Her mother had always been unhappy and dissatisfied. She had an older sister who was developmentally disabled. She was going to be responsible for paying for their life expenses. She was now
the head of the family.
She was the head of the family. And that propelled her with the kind of drive that then made her the incredible success professionally that she was, but also the kind of lack of no such success on her personal side. Yeah. She sacrificed what might have been personal gratification and in pursuit of fame and fortune.
She was married again twice more? Mm-hmm.
3 times married, 3 times divorced. She adopted a child, a newborn daughter. None of the marriages lasted. She was estranged from her daughter for a time, although they eventually reconciled. She had good friends. She had some good friends, but everyone involved in her life, her husbands, her daughter, her friends, understood that when push came to shove, her work would come before they did.
Why did she get married? I mean, if this was not something that was really, family oriented, something that really drove her, were they? What were the marriages like?
So I think there were, number one, societal expectations that you got married, that you weren't maybe successful as a woman or complete as a woman if you weren't married and had children. I think she also liked the idea of being married, and I think she liked the idea of having children. Mm-hmm. It's just the reality that tripped her up, because the reality of having children, as you know, is you've got to put them first some of the time. Not maybe at every single day, morning, noon, and night, but there are times when your children come first, even if it's going to cost you something in your career. And there are times in a marriage, too, that you've got to make that a priority. And for her, that was simply impossible to do.
She once told a conference in Virginia what was impossible.
She said, impossible to have a career,
a great
career, and a great marriage, and a great mother. Were those the 3 things?
Children.
Children, yes. That you could maybe you could get 2 out of 3, but you could never get never get all 3. She was getting a Lifetime Achievement Award in Los Angeles, and she said something that I find quite astounding. She said, in speaking about being honored for her lifetime of achievement, she said, children, they grow up and they move away. But all this, your fame and your fortune, that lasts forever. And this is, of course, the opposite of the conclusion that many people come to, which is that on your deathbed, you never say, I wish I had gone to the office more.
The old Barbara Bush line, you wouldn't wish win one more case, one more trial. It's to be with the ones you love. And isn't that interesting? Because that continued to be Barbara Walters' focus, that it was not family. It was what you had done in public as your own record and your own achievements that would sustain you?
Not only what you had done yesterday. What you had done a decade ago, okay, that's fine, but what have you done yesterday? What are you doing tomorrow? When she finally retired from the View when she was in her 80s, and one of the women backstage came up and said, what do you wish for? Thinking she would say, I want to learn to play the piano or travel to the Bahamas, or I wish to whatever.
Yeah.
And she said, I want more time, meaning more time on the air.
Yeah. Fascinating. Let me ask you a little bit about Susan Page and how you came to not only author, but how you got into journalism. You and I have covered politics and presidents together for, I forget, when did you come to Washington?
So I covered the 1980 presidential campaign for Newsday and then went on the White House. And you were, of course, already a very well-established figure there.
Yeah, I'd been there for a couple of years, and 1980 was a watershed year. Can you imagine a candidate for president not only beating the incumbent who was up for re-election, but winning 44 states and then 49 states in his re-election? It was a fascinating time to be. But how did you go into journalism in the first place?
So I, I liked, like many journalists, I worked on my high school paper and on my high school
and this
yearbook
is
in Wichita,
Nebraska,
Kansas. But I liked other things too besides journalism. I really, and this sounds possibly ridiculous now, but I was very serious about playing the oboe. I played the oboe since I was in the 3rd grade, and I went to music camp at University of Kansas in the summers, and I played in the state youth orchestra, and I really loved the oboe, and I loved classical music and performing in small and orchestras and also in smaller groups. And so it was, at the time, a very hard decision to make. And it was impossible for me to envision doing both things, playing the oboe and being a journalist. And in the end, journalism won out. No, as Barbara Walters would say, no regrets.
Good.
But I went then to Northwestern University, to the Medill School of Journalism. I got a master's degree at Columbia. I went to work for Newsday. They brought me to Washington and put me on the White House in national politics. And then some years later, I moved to USA Today.
So at USA Today, which was begun right after 1980. Remember, 1980 was the beginning of CNN, and Al Newharth was putting together USA Today, changing the face of print journalism. And I must say that during the years when I first came to the White House in late 74, newspapers dominated the White House press corps and dominated the national conversation of what was news. By the time you got into the 80s and beyond, it was more the charts and pie graphs on the front page of the colorful USA Today, and it was cable news and network news that made a real difference.
And now we have a news media landscape that has just exploded. There are so many ways people can be informed, so many ways they find their news, and many of them do not involve broadcast networks or newspapers. This is a world in which we have had to adjust.
It really is. So you are in Washington, and you are busy. You are the editor of the USA Today.
Washington Bureau Chief.
Washington Bureau Chief. And you have time to write a book or 3. How do you do that?
So I like to say I no longer do anything I don't like doing, which is a good, a privileged way to live. And I very much like being involved in the daily news mix for USA Today. But I also have had writing these 3 books it's been like learning a new muscle to use. It's a different kind of research. You know, you spend 2 years doing research. It's different than when you're doing a story and you have 2 hours or 2 days to do research. It's a different kind of writing, this long form writing. So it has just been such fun to figure out how to do this.
What about, let me see, I want to go back to Barbara Walters a little bit on her approach to the people she interviewed, because her interviews were often deeper, longer than things that we would do for normal news coverage. How did she get such things as the interview with Fidel Castro?
So she spent 2 years trying to get an interview with Fidel Castro. She started it when she was at NBC's Today Show. She was still working on it when she went to ABC. And it was the first really big interview she got that she landed after she had gone to ABC. It was in this period in 1977 when she was feeling so beleaguered. But she didn't get, this with the passage of time and the release of historical documents, we know she did not get this interview just because she finally wore down the Cubans and Fidel Castro. She got it because there was a secret behind-the-scenes effort between the Nixon White House and then the Ford White House and the Cuban government to try to normalize relations, to try to get on a better footing with Cuba. It didn't end up going so well, but there was an effort to do that. And this interview, this exclusive interview that they gave Barbara Walters, was part of an effort by the Cubans to present a different side of Fidel Castro. This is not something that Barbara Walters knew at the time, nor would she have cared why she got the interview. She only cared that she got the interview. And it's the most wonderful interview. They go on a boat across the Bay of Pigs.
It's not even an interview, it's a whole life, a day in the life of Fidel.
It became a 1-hour special. They cross the Bay of Pigs in a boat, and Fidel Castro talks about how he likes to spearfish there. And he drives a Jeep with her in the front seat across the mountains to go to this mountain retreat, where he gives her his gun to hold aloft as they go through streams so his gun doesn't get wet. And they end up and have this feast with a whole roasted pig and wine from Argentina. And it sparked all these rumors that they were more than friends, which she denied. But it was unmistakable that they had the kind of connection that Barbara Walters often forged with the people she interviewed, with powerful men, even the most controversial ones. She could forge a connection that made her interviews crackle.
It was the questions that she chose to ask. That was an art form for her.
She was fearless. She went to interview Vladimir Putin in the first interview that he gave to a Western journalist after the 9/11 attacks. So a very big interview, and a very controversial figure, Vladimir Putin, not someone with whom she had a spark like she did with Fidel Castro. And her practice was to work on questions on 3x5 cards and rearrange them and figure them out, and then to finally have them typed on 5x7 cards, and that was what she took into an interview with the questions that she wanted to ask. And she knew the question she wanted to ask Vladimir Putin last, but she never put it on a card because she was worried that the Russian Secret Service would be doing surveillance and might see the card, might come in and search her room, might somehow find out what the questions were. Yeah. She didn't want Vladimir Putin to know this question beforehand. And she was worried. She asked it last because she was worried he would stand up and walk out. So she does a good interview with Vladimir Putin, and then she says, I have one final question. Have you ever ordered someone killed? Now, Vladimir Putin is a former KGB chief. We are quite certain he has ordered people killed in recent years. He says, completely impassive, "Niet." And that was the end of the interview.
That is an art form. It really is. What happened to Barbara Walters when she moved into the time where she put together the TV show The View, which, daytime television, chatty girl stuff. What was the reaction to that, and why did she really believe, she and Bill Getty, her producer, really believed that was something they could move forward with?
Well, Bill Getty, her longtime producer, who I interviewed several times for the book and has since passed away, he had always wanted to do a daytime show. And he had talked about it for years. And Barbara was interested in it as well. And Barbara told Bill that her daughter, Jackie, that talking with her daughter, Jackie, made her think, why don't we do an interview show with women of different ages and perspectives? Because rather than have all women of the same point of view or women of all about the same age, let's have young women, older women, a mix, and have these lively conversations like I have with my daughter. And so ABC had a daytime slot, 11 o'clock in the morning, where a series of shows had failed. And because they were desperate, they were willing to give this show a shot, even though the executives at ABC were not at all convinced it would work. And you know how they knew, you know how Bill Getty knew they didn't think it would work? They refused to buy a new set. They made them use the set that was left over from one of the soap operas that had failed.
Oh, for heaven's sakes.
And so they've gotten a new set since then. And by the way, it succeeded. But it started with these rather low expectations with a group of 4 or 5 women sitting around a table. Barbara Walters was often there. Often, not always, but often there. And Rune Arledge warned Barbara that this would undermine the serious reputation she had built up. And Barbara worried some about that. But it was also a chance, Barbara said, for her to show something other than herself as an inquisitor. You know, she was a pushy cookie, she used to say. We all knew her as someone who just pushed one question after another, in a very serious way. This gave her a chance to show a little humor, to talk about her personal life. She would dress up for the Halloween shows as Marilyn Monroe. When they were doing a show at Las Vegas, she was carried in by 4 gladiators. So it was a side of Barbara Walters no one had ever seen. And, you know, and I think for some younger people, that what they remember about Barbara Walters is the View, not the serious big interviews that she did.
There's a generational shift, and she does get, they still do, get prominent newsmakers on there. I remember Barack Obama.
The first president to do a daytime show, and it was Barack Obama on The View, and when they teased him about it, he said, I wanted to do a show that Michelle would watch.
Very, very true. Switching, and one of the ABC producers once told me that The View was a money-making machine.
And one thing to remember about Barbara Walters, and another part of her legacy from her father, she kept a piece of that. She was owner of part of The View. Barbara Walters, Barwell Productions. So it was to her great financial benefit as well. And she would tell women in broadcasting, get something for yourself. Don't just get paid a salary. Get a stake in it, because that is where you can achieve real financial security.
And I think that's a pattern in American networks now. Very often you'll see Good Morning America anchor has her own production company. Some male anchors have their own production companies, and they've taken that Barbara Walters advice.
And when she did this, as with many things, some in journalism were aghast. You know, she hired a PR agency early on to get her name out there, and that was something serious journalists didn't do. Starting her own production company, that was something that was seen, you know, maybe a little bit unseemly for a serious journalist. And now, as you say, it's something that's widely adopted.
Absolutely. When you did the work on the Barbara Walters book, you had also done this for 2 other very different women. But are they just kind of totally separate, or is there a thread that runs through the 3 books, Barbara Bush, Nancy Pelosi, and Barbara Walters?
Such a good question, because I just kind of, I now see a pattern, but a pattern I fell into. You know, I was interested in doing a book about Barbara Bush for my first book because I had covered her, and I thought she was very consequential, and I thought people had a great misunderstanding about who she was. They thought she was this lovable grandmother, when in fact she was a force to be reckoned with, and someone with strong views who had a big impact. So it was just because it was someone I had covered who I thought was interesting, who was older. She was in her 90s. So I thought maybe she would talk to me and be more honest than earlier in her life, which turned out to be true. I did 6 interviews with her in the last 6 months of her life. And so that was a good experience. And it was, so then I found that I liked doing books. And Nancy Pelosi was the most powerful woman in the history of the American government, and there was no good biography of her. So I set out to write a biography about Nancy Pelosi's use of power. So that was my second book. And then this third book on Barbara Walters, another consequential woman. And, you know, the thing that ties them together, I think, is they're all women of the silent generation. They're women who were born before the second wave women's movement, before Barbara Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, had been published. All of them were born and with zero expectations of themselves and anyone else that they would amount to somebody worth a book.
Barbara Bush, the daughter of a famous wealthy publisher. Nancy Pelosi, daughter of a Baltimore
mayor
yeah. and lively political presence. And Barbara Walters.
Big impresario. So the
yeah.
daughters of men of some consequence. But Lou D'Alessandro, the father of Nancy Pelosi, thought his sons might become mayor. It never occurred to him that his daughter might, his only daughter might. It never occurred to Nancy D'Alessandro that she might. And Nancy D'Alessandro, Nancy D'Alessandro Pelosi, was 47 the first time she ran for office.
Isn't that amazing?
And Barbara Walters was 28 when she suddenly thought, I need to get a career because I have to support my family. You know, there are threads that go to them. There are women who ended up their lives in ways they never could have foreseen at the time they were born.
I remember a moment with Barbara Bush, early in her husband's term. She did a town hall at the Kennedy Center here in Washington, where hundreds of women, thousands of women came to listen to her. And at one point, I said, and of course you sacrificed your college education. You left Smith College to marry George Bush. And we came backstage afterward, and she turned and all but grabbed me by the nape of my neck. She said, I never sacrificed anything. I left school because I wanted to marry George Bush as he headed off to war. So all three of those women had in them, in their era, that kind of bottled energy that Barbara Walters really, really displayed.
They were all made of steel, and they all faced some significant hurdles, and the thing that drew me to each of them is that they all made a difference. The world is different. The world is different for me personally, for women generally, and in other ways, in ways that affect all of us. The world is different because Barbara Bush and Nancy Pelosi and Barbara Walters were around.
Absolutely. Do you think that during this age there will be ever a woman president?
Oh, yes, of course. Absolutely, 100%. Don't you?
Yes, I think, but we've waited so long.
We're pretty slow. But, you know, I think about, America didn't decide we would elect a black president. America decided we would elect Barack Obama. And I think the same thing will happen. It's not that America will say, okay, it's time to elect a woman president. America will say, here's a candidate who is a woman who is the person who should be president.
Who fits all the criteria.
I think in our lifetime.
Yeah. Well, I certainly hope so. When you were doing research on Barbara Walters, were you able to talk to, obviously you couldn't talk to her because she was now kind of out of the picture. Did she have close friends that were helpful?
So at the time I started the book, Barbara Walters was in declining health. And she was sometimes, I think, totally cogent and sometimes not. She knew I was doing the book. Her longtime agent, or PR representative, Cindy Berger, acted as a go-between, told her I was working on it. She put up, it's not an authorized book. She didn't officially cooperate, but she didn't put up any new hurdles in my way, which was all I really asked for. So when I called her friends and family members and people she had worked with in the past, Barbara Walters did not tell them not to talk to me.
So that opened the door without her having to advocate for it.
And not every single person talked to me. Her daughter, Jackie, declined to talk to me. She's done almost no interviews and is a very private person. But yes, I interviewed some of Barbara's great, good friends. I interviewed some of the women and men that she worked with, like Bill Getty and Richard Wald, who was for a time the head of NBC News.
And later ABC.
And later ABC. And a great friend of Barbara Walters, who, when Barbara Walters decided she wanted to go see Deep Throat, remember that porn movie that came out that had a kind of following? She made Dick Wald take her there because she didn't want to go alone.
I would hope she took somebody with her, and Dick Wald would be probably a perfect acerbic escort for something like that.
I did about 150 interviews for the book.
Wow.
And I looked in, there weren't great archival resources, but there were some archives I also looked at, which were helpful. The Barbara Walter archives at Sarah Lawrence College, and the Rune Arledge archives, and a few others.
I was going to ask about the Barbara Walters archives. Are they searchable? Are they open, or do you have to have special permission to get in?
So they're just at the beginning of being processed, and they're not very complete. They you know what you want to find. You want to find this personal letter that they wrote that is the thing.
And it's such a moment.
Exactly. I couldn't find that. And I'm hoping now that she has passed away that perhaps she has made provisions to put more of her papers there at Sarah Lawrence. I hope so.
Yeah. The one moment in the book I just love, it is 2010, and at ABC News, and Rune Arledge is president, or is it David Weston by now? And they want to show team spirit, and what do?
So it was David Weston, and Rune Arledge had fomented all these rivalries, not just between Diane Sawyer and Barbara Walters, but between men in his employ, male journalists as well. This was part of the Rune Arledge method, but it was a really cutthroat culture, and David Weston wanted to show that they were working as a team. And so there was a famous picture that Rune Arledge had taken of the 7 big anchors of ABC, which included Barbara Walters. Well, David Weston arranged a portrait of several dozen, maybe 26 anchors of all sorts to show that they were all in this together. And he told them all to wear gray or black so that they would look like a team, right? They wouldn't be
almost
dressed identically.
Uniform.
Not quite a uniform, but sort of like to wear muted
uniformity.
colors. Yeah. So they're all lined up. It's, of course, you can imagine the logistical challenges of getting this done. They finally get everybody there, Diane Sawyer, George Stephanopoulos, and others. And in walks Barbara Walters at the last minute wearing a bright red jacket. And of course, they have saved a space for her right in the middle of this picture.
Right in front.
She goes in, she takes her chair, she sits, they take the picture. And so the picture that you see is all these others in muted colors. Diane Sawyer is wearing a white blouse, a black skirt, and a red belt. And then this bright red figure in the middle who is pretty clearly the captain of the team.
Amazing. Amazing. At the end, there was no big funeral for Barbara Walters. Tim Russert, when he died, was the Kennedy Center. Peter Jennings, we went to Carnegie Hall. Was it because, why do you think there was?
So that was a great surprise to me. And I was in the middle of finishing up the book then, and I thought, this will be wonderful for the book. I mean, what a wonderful moment to see her memorial service. It did not take place. Her remains were cremated and given to her daughter. Her daughter, who is very private, did not want, my understanding is, her daughter did not want to have a big memorial service. ABC decided, my understanding is, that you couldn't really have it without only with her closest relative being there, with her daughter being uncomfortable or not being there. So they didn't have one. You know, Barbara went to 1 million of those.
Oh yes.
And spoke at a bunch of them. And I can only imagine she would have reveled in being honored by all these friends and frenemies at a memorial service, but it didn't happen. And in fact, her burial was private. And it took.
Where is she buried?
So it wasn't announced. It wasn't public. I knew from the research I had done that she had intended to be buried in the cemetery in Miami where her father and mother and sister were buried. So I was pretty sure she was buried there, but the cemetery refused to cooperate. And I finally hired a researcher who had to move heaven and earth to do in-depth research to find the gravestone with no one's help. which she did, the researcher did, and it's a small gravestone close to the ground next to her mother, father, and sister, and it says, "No regrets, I had a great life."
What a coda. Susan, let me finish by asking you, if Barbara Walters in her 90s was still active and around, and if she said, "Why, Susan, of course I'll sit for an interview with you," what 2 or 3 questions would you ask Barbara Walters?
Well, I'd want them to be good. And I would probably ask myself, what would Barbara ask? Because she was enormously skilled in shaping questions that got to the heart of the matter and that were impossible to dodge. She knew that the more words you had around a question, the easier it would be for someone to dodge it. So I think if I were going to ask her 3 questions, I might ask her, what's your best memory? And let's see if she says something professional or personal. What's your biggest regret? Because she may say she has no regrets, but none of us have no regrets. And then I think the final question I would ask perhaps would be, were you happy?
You asked that question of many of the people you interviewed. The verdict?
Well, a few said yes, she was happy. Joy Behar, the co-host on The View, said happy-ish. There's no question she was very proud of what she did, and she was proud of the money she made and the achievements she had. But almost everyone else I talked to said no. She was never content. She was not happy.
Susan Page, thank you.
Thank you, Anne.
Thanks for listening to this week's Afterwards podcast. If you are interested in podcasts about nonfiction books, listen to C-SPAN's Book Notes Plus podcast for interviews with authors and historians hosted by Brian Lamb.